feeling of debt, whether it's a mortgage, student loans, maybe just credit cards, it's a heavyweight, something I think many of us know really well.
Absolutely. And today we're going to dive into that feeling, but zoom way out. We're looking at the huge history of debt itself, mostly drawing on David Graeber's big book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years.
Right. And Graeber, well, he was an anthropologist, so he took this incredibly broad view, looked at debt through, moral, religious, political lenses, not just economics, across 5,000 years.
Yeah, it's ambitious. Our goal with this deep dive is really to pull out the core insights from his work, to maybe challenge some of those basic ideas we have about debt, about money, and even how we relate to each other.
It sounds like a lot covering that much history.
Yeah.
But honestly, what comes out are some really surprising ideas, things that really push back against the standard way we think about debt.
Okay, so let's start with something foundational. That story you always hear in Economics 101, barter. The idea that first people traded goods directly, apples for shoes, that sort of thing.
Adam Smith's famous line, right? Humans as animals that make bargains.
Yeah.
That whole idea fits right in.
Exactly. It seems logical on the surface, but Graeber throws a wrench in it. He basically asks, where's the actual evidence? Is there any real proof that barter was the main way societies exchanged things?
That's a good question. You just kind of assume it's true.
Right. And anthropology, Graeber points out, suggests something different. When barter did happen, it was often, pretty tense, maybe even hostile, usually between strangers, people who didn't have existing relationships, not within tight-knit communities.
Okay, so if barter wasn't the starting point, what does Graeber think was?
He argues that systems of credit, basically IOUs, probably came before formal money, especially in communities that were built on, trust and knowing you could count on each other.
That makes sense in a small community setting.
And what's really fascinating is how in some societies, especially ones trying to stay egalitarian, they actively avoided calculating debts, precisely. Think about hunter-gatherer groups.
How?
Well, there's this quote from Peter Feuchten talking about Inuit culture. Quote, "By gifts one makes slaves, and by whips one makes dogs." The idea was that keeping exact track, constantly settling up, actually creates hierarchy. It turns relationships into something transactional.
Wow. That really makes you think about, when you're out with close friends and someone insists on calculating the bill down to the penny, that slightly awkward feeling.
Exactly. Graeber suggests that discomfort might actually be tapping into this much older way of thinking, where the relationship itself is way more important than a perfectly balanced sheet.
Okay, so that connects to Graeber's ideas about where money itself came from. It wasn't just about making trade easier.
Apparently not, or at least not primarily. He proposes that money developed more to deal with debts that were kind of unpayable otherwise. Think about big societal obligations, maybe even religious ones, these primordial debts to the gods or the universe or the community, debts you couldn't just settle with a favor.
So less about simple commerce, more about settling these deep, almost moral obligations. It's interesting how that moral weight of debt still hangs around today, isn't it? Even when economists talk about lenders just accepting risk.
It really does persist. And then following that, you get the emergence of coinage, actual physical money. Graeber links this pretty directly to warfare.
Warfare, how does that connect?
He talks about what he calls the military coinage slave complex in big empires, Rome, India, China. Think about it. Rulers need to pay soldiers. How do you do that efficiently over vast distances? Coins.
Okay, that makes sense for paying armies.
But then there's the other side. How do you get the resources to make the coins and fund the empire? You conquer people and then you demand taxes be paid in your currency. This forced people into the money economy, often needing to sell goods or even themselves or family members into servitude just to get the coins to pay the tax.
So coinage could become a tool of control, even enslavement, in that context. A very different feel from those early community credit systems.
A huge contrast. Those earlier systems were based on personal trust and ongoing relationships. Hard currency, because it's anonymous, changes everything. It allows for transactions between strangers, yes, but it can also depersonalize exchange.
This seems like a good place to introduce Graeber's broader framework. He talks about 3 basic moral principles underlying economic life, right?
Yes, and this is really insightful. He calls them communism, hierarchy, and exchange. He argues that all 3 are actually present in pretty much every society, just in different mixes and interactions.
Okay, let's break those down. Communism sounds loaded, but he doesn't mean the political system, does he?
No, not at all in the political sense. He calls it baseline communism. It's that fundamental human tendency towards mutual aid, operating on the principle of from each according to their ability to each according to their need.
Like asking someone for directions, or helping a neighbor carry something heavy.
Exactly like that.
Yeah.
Simple, everyday acts of cooperation where you don't expect immediate repayment. It's the bedrock of just getting along, the basic social glue.
Okay, baseline communism, then hierarchy. That seems more straightforward.
Yeah, that one's more intuitive. It's about how social status, identity, rank, how those things change the rules of interaction. If someone is seen as clearly above or below you, the normal expectations of give and take, of reciprocity, might get suspended or altered. Think feudalism or caste systems, or even just family dynamics sometimes.
Right, and the third one is exchange.
Exchange covers the more balanced forms of interaction. This includes straightforward commercial buying and selling, but also things like gift giving, where there's an expectation of some kind of return, even if it's not immediate or precisely calculated.
So where does debt fit into these 3?
That's where it gets complicated, according to Graeber. Debt is tricky because it looks like exchange and agreement between equals for future repayment. But in practice, it instantly creates hierarchy. One person is indebted, subordinate to the other, until the debt is paid.
So it's a hierarchical relationship pretending to be one of equal exchange.
Precisely. And he argues this inherent contradiction is why debt, especially when interest or usury gets involved, often leads to so much moral confusion and social tension.
That tension leads into another really big idea in the book.
Yeah.
These historical cycles he identifies, swinging back and forth between economies dominated by credit and those dominated by coin or bullion.
Yes, these grand cycles. He starts way back with the first big agrarian empires, like in Mesopotamia around 3500 BC. These societies, surprisingly, ran heavily on credit. They even had mathematically calculated interest rates.
Interest that early.
Oh yeah, recorded on cuneiform tablets. But this also led pretty quickly to problems. Widespread debt, people falling into debt bondage, losing their land, their freedom.
It's familiar. How do they deal with that?
They invented something remarkable, the debt jubilee. Periodic declarations by rulers, clean slates, canceling agrarian debts, freeing debt servants, essentially hitting reset to prevent society from completely breaking down under the weight of debt.
Wow. A societal safety valve. So that was an age of credit. What came next?
Then comes what Karl Jaspers called the Axial Age, roughly 800 BC to 600 AD. This is the era of coinage, linked, as we mentioned, to the rise of big empires, standing armies, and large-scale warfare across Eurasia. Money became much more impersonal, metallic.
So a swing towards hard currency. Did it stay that way?
No, the pendulum swung back.
Mm-hmm.
During the Middle Ages, especially from about 600 AD to 1450 AD, Graeber argues we see a return to credit-based economies, particularly in the Islamic world where prohibitions on usury encourage commerce based on trust and partnerships. And even in Europe, local credit systems flourished. Precious metals were still around, but often more for rulers, for tribute, not everyday transactions for most people.
So another age of credit based more on trust and relationships again.
Right. But then comes another major shift, around 1450 onwards. He points particularly to China's decision around that time to consolidate its monetary system and demand taxes be paid in silver.
China moving to silver. Why was that so globally significant?
Because China was such a huge economic powerhouse, suddenly there was this massive global demand for silver to trade with China. And where was the silver? Mostly in the Americas. This, Graeber argues, directly fueled European exploration, conquest, and the massive expansion of the Atlantic slave trade, all driven by the hunt for precious metals to pay for Chinese goods.
That's a staggering connection, a monetary policy decision in China having such brutal worldwide consequences.
It really highlights how interconnected these things are. And then he brings us towards the modern era, which he saw as starting around 1971 when the US went off the gold standard. He initially viewed this as the dawn of a new age of virtual money, perhaps with US Treasury bonds acting as a kind of global tribute, a new form of imperial debt.
Okay, that's a whirlwind tour through 5,000 years of history. Let's just pause for a second here. If If you're finding this deep dive into debt as fascinating and maybe mind-bending as we are, please do take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps us create more content like this for you.
Definitely. So picking back up, let's think more about how Graeber sees debt impacting our actual relationships, our social connections.
Right, because his argument isn't just economic or historical, it's deeply social.
Exactly. He argues that when debt reduces everything to a number, to an accounting unit, it can really sever relationships. It risks dehumanizing people by turning social bonds, which should be flexible and ongoing, into cold, quantifiable obligations.
It strips away the context, the humanity.
Precisely. Compare that to the kind of debt that exists in strong, ongoing relationships: favors, support, kindness. These are debts, in a way, but they're usually unquantifiable, unpayable even. And trying to put an exact price on them, trying to settle them like a commercial debt, can actually damage the relationship itself.
Because the relationship isn't about the transaction, it's about the mutual care and support.
Right. And historically, Graeber points to the horrific examples of human beings themselves being used as currency, particularly women and slaves, as the ultimate expression of this dehumanization, reducing a person entirely to an item of exchange. He also contrasts debt with something like patronage, where, historically, there are responsibilities on both sides, compared to an impersonal loan where the creditor's obligation often ends once the money is lent.
Bringing this into today's world, it's hard not to see Graeber's points reflected in our modern reliance on debt, especially, say, in America.
It seems almost structural, doesn't it? For many people, taking on debt isn't really an optional strategy. It's the only way to access essentials like housing, education, even healthcare. You could almost argue it's framed as an American duty to borrow and spend to keep the economy going.
But there's a huge downside to that structure.
A massive one. Especially for people with fewer resources. They often have the greatest need for credit, but face the worst terms, the highest interest rates. And the consequences of defaulting aren't just financial penalties. They can be utterly devastating: loss of home, garnished wages, destroyed futures.
It's a stark contrast to that historical idea of freedom, often being linked to release from debt, like those ancient jubilees.
Absolutely. Graeber even draws a parallel, maybe a provocative one, between modern wage labor and historical slavery, suggesting both can be impersonal systems where human connection is secondary once money changes hands.
And yet, even in this system, he notes something quite poignant. People often go into debt not just for pure necessity, but for social reasons.
Yes, that's a crucial observation. People borrow for weddings, funerals, to help family, to maintain social ties, to celebrate with friends. It's like we're using the tools of a cold market system to try and shore up the very human connections that system often undermines.
So if we were to try and distill some of the biggest takeaways from Graeber's massive work, what would they be?
Well, first, that whole textbook story about barter being the origin of money, it's almost certainly a myth. There's just no real evidence for it as a primary system.
Okay, myth of barter debunked. What else?
Second, debt and credit have a much, much longer and more complex history than we usually think. They're not just recent financial inventions, they're deeply woven into human history, morality, and religion for millennia.
And money itself isn't simple either.
Not at all. Money seems to have this dual nature. It can represent trust and community obligation, like early credit systems, or it can represent scarcity, state power, and impersonal transactions, like coinage and empires. And which one dominates has huge social consequences.
Crucially, debt isn't just an economic number. It's tangled up with morality, social standing, political power. It shapes how we see ourselves and relate to each other.
Exactly. And our current relationship with debt, our whole system, isn't some random outcome. It has these deep historical roots stretching back through those cycles of credit and coin, and it carries really profound implications for what we mean by freedom and what genuine human connection looks like.
So maybe a final thought to leave everyone with, something to chew on from all this.
Perhaps it's this. Think about those unpayable debts in your own life. The kindness, the support, the care you give and receive that you wouldn't dream of putting a price tag on. How do those shape your most important relationships?
And then ask yourself, does our current economic system, so heavily focused on quantifiable, interest-bearing debt, truly reflect or support those fundamental human values?
It's a big question, and we've really only scratched the surface here today. If you want to explore these ideas further, we've put together an exclusive visual mind map summarizing the key concepts from Graeber's Debt. You can find the link for that right in the description below.
Definitely check that out. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today on the Inspired Podcast.